Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The morning of October 12, 2001, started like any other at Luynes Prison in southern France. Guards patrolled the concrete yards, inmates shuffled to their work assignments, and the Mediterranean sun climbed slowly over the limestone walls. But at exactly 9:47 in the morning, everything changed. The sound came first, a distant mechanical thunder that grew louder with each passing second. Prisoners in the exercise yard looked up, squinting against the bright sky. Then they saw it. A white helicopter, descending fast and furious, dropping altitude with the precision of a military operation. It wasn't supposed to be there. Within seconds, the helicopter hovered directly over the prison yard, its rotors whipping dust and debris into a blinding storm. Two men in black balaclavas rappelled down thick ropes, moving with the speed and confidence of trained operatives. They carried bolt cutters and assault rifles. The guards froze, caught completely off guard. This wasn't a prison break. This was an extraction. The men landed hard on the concrete, cutting through the stunned silence with barked commands. They moved with purpose toward one man, a lean figure with sharp eyes and a calm expression that suggested he'd been expecting this all along. His name was Pascal Payet, and he was about to become a legend. Payet, a convicted armed robber serving a 30-year sentence, had orchestrated the entire operation from inside his cell. Using smuggled mobile phones and coded messages passed through visitors, he'd coordinated with accomplices on the outside to rent the helicopter under false pretenses. The pilot, a civilian with no criminal record, had been told they were filming a documentary. He realized the truth only when guns were pointed at his head mid-flight. By then, it was too late to turn back. The masked men grabbed Payet, securing him in a harness as guards below finally scrambled into action. Gunfire erupted, bullets ricocheting off the helicopter's metal frame, but the pilot pulled up hard, lifting the craft and its human cargo into the sky. Within 90 seconds of arrival, they were gone, vanishing over the pine forests that stretched toward the coast. The entire prison stood in stunned silence. Pascal Payet had just escaped in broad daylight, plucked from one of France's most secure facilities like a prize being lifted by a crane. The audacity was breathtaking. The execution was flawless. And for the French authorities, it was an absolute nightmare. Payet wasn't just any criminal. Born in 1963 in Montpellier, he'd grown up in the rough neighborhoods of southern France, where poverty and opportunity collided in dangerous ways. By his 20s, he was already deep into organized crime, specializing in armed robberies that were meticulously planned and brutally executed. He was smart, disciplined, and utterly fearless. But it was his charm that made him truly dangerous. People liked him, trusted him, followed him. Even behind bars, he commanded loyalty. After the helicopter disappeared from sight, a massive manhunt was launched. Roadblocks went up across 3 regions. Helicopters, this time belonging to law enforcement, swept the countryside. But Payet and his crew had vanished like ghosts. Days turned into weeks. Tips flooded in from across Europe, but none led anywhere concrete. Payet had planned not just his escape, but his invisibility. He moved through safe houses, changed appearances, used fake passports. He was a phantom, always one step ahead. 3 months later, French authorities finally caught a break. An informant tipped them off to a villa in the Spanish town of Marbella, a sun-soaked playground for the rich and the criminal alike. A raid was organized, swift and surgical. When officers burst through the door, they found Payet sitting at a table, calmly eating breakfast. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply smiled, as if he'd been expecting them. As if this was all part of a larger game. They arrested him on the spot and extradited him back to France, where he was placed in a maximum security facility designed to prevent exactly what he'd done before. The walls were higher. The surveillance was tighter. The guards were warned. Pascal Payet would not escape again. But when investigators began digging deeper into his time on the run, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. Payet hadn't just been hiding. He'd been planning. And what they found in his notes, his contacts, his blueprints, suggested that his first escape was only the beginning. Pascal Payet sat in his new cell at Grasse Prison, a fortress built into the hills of the French Riviera. The walls were reinforced concrete, 20 feet thick in places. Motion sensors lined every corridor. Guard towers offered 360-degree views of the surrounding landscape. It was supposed to be escape-proof. The warden had personally assured the Ministry of Justice that Payet was contained. But sitting alone in his cell, Payet smiled to himself. They didn't understand. Walls didn't hold him. Fear didn't control him. And loyalty, the kind he'd earned over decades in the criminal underworld, couldn't be locked away. For 2.5 years, Payet played the model prisoner. He kept his head down, followed the rules, attended every scheduled activity. He read books, exercised, and spoke politely to guards. To anyone watching, he seemed resigned to his fate, a once dangerous criminal now broken by the system. But beneath the surface, his mind was working, calculating, planning. He was studying guard rotations, mapping blind spots in the security cameras, and most importantly, communicating. Smuggled phones hidden in hollowed-out books, messages coded in letters to family members, and visitors who carried more than just words of encouragement. Payet was building another operation, more ambitious than the first. Then came July 14, 2007, Bastille Day, France's national holiday. While the country celebrated with fireworks and parades, Grasse Prison was operating with a skeleton crew. Many guards had requested time off, leaving the facility understaffed and vulnerable. Payet had been counting on this. At approximately 11 in the morning, as inmates gathered in the recreation yard for their daily exercise, the sound returned. That unmistakable mechanical roar that sent ice through the veins of every guard who remembered what happened 6 years earlier. The helicopter appeared suddenly, cresting over the perimeter wall like a predator swooping on prey. It was a hijacked tourist helicopter, stolen just hours before from a nearby airfield. The pilot, once again a civilian, had a gun pressed to his ribs and tears streaming down his face. This time, there were 4 men rappelling down, not 2. They moved with military precision, hitting the ground in a coordinated pattern that created a defensive perimeter. They carried automatic weapons and smoke grenades, which they immediately deployed, filling the yard with thick gray clouds that turned the world into chaos. Guards shouted into radios, calling for backup, for air support, for anything. But it was too late. The operation was already in motion. Through the smoke, the masked men found Payet immediately, as if they'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. They cut through his restraints with industrial bolt cutters and fitted him with a harness. Gunfire erupted from the guard towers, muzzle flashes cutting through the smoke, but the return fire from the escaping team was overwhelming. Guards dove for cover as bullets tore through sandbags and shattered windows. Then something unexpected happened. As Payet was being hoisted toward the helicopter, he gave a signal. 2 of the masked men grabbed 2 other inmates, Eric Alborio and Michel Valero, both serving time for armed robbery and both part of Payet's inner circle. This wasn't just an escape. It was a prison break for 3. The helicopter strained under the weight, rotors screaming as the pilot fought to maintain altitude. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like the aircraft might crash, plummeting back into the prison yard in a fireball. But the pilot, despite his terror, was skilled. He compensated, adjusting the pitch and throttle with desperate precision. The helicopter climbed, slowly at first, then faster, arcing away from Grasse Prison and disappearing into the cloudless Mediterranean sky. The entire operation took less than 5 minutes. By the time reinforcements arrived, the helicopter was gone, and 3 of France's most wanted criminals were free. The authorities were humiliated. The media went into a frenzy. How could this happen again? How could the same man escape the same way twice? Questions were asked in Parliament, heads rolled in the prison system, and a nationwide alert was issued. But Payet and his companions had already gone underground. The helicopter was found abandoned in a rural field 20 kilometers away, torched to destroy evidence. From there, the trail went cold. For weeks, investigators followed dead ends and false leads. They raided apartments in Marseille, safe houses in Lyon, suspected hideouts in Corsica. But Payet was a ghost, moving through networks of loyal criminals who would rather die than betray him. Then, 3 months after the escape, a robbery occurred that had Payet's signature all over it. An armored truck carrying €4 million was ambushed on a rural highway outside Marseille. The crew used military-grade explosives and precision timing. They escaped without firing a shot, disappearing into the countryside before police could respond. The money was never recovered. Payet had funded his freedom. But success made him careless, or perhaps overconfident. In September 2007, Spanish police acting on intelligence from French authorities raided a luxury apartment in the town of Fuengirola, on Spain's Costa del Sol. They found Payet, Alborio, and Valero living under false identities, enjoying the spoils of their freedom. This time, the arrest was coordinated with military precision. No chances were taken. Payet was extradited immediately, placed in a high-security convoy, and transported under armed guard back to France. They weren't taking any more risks. He was sent to a different prison this time, one with protocols specifically designed for him. Solitary confinement. No outside contact. Constant surveillance. The authorities believed they'd finally contained the problem. But in his cell, late at night, Payet stared at the ceiling and smiled. Because he knew something they didn't. Loyalty doesn't die behind bars. And desperation makes people do extraordinary things. His crew on the outside hadn't given up. They were already planning something bigger, something bolder. Something that would make his first 2 escapes look like practice runs. And then, on a cold April morning in 2008, the impossible happened again. April 14, 2008. The sun hadn't yet risen over the Brécourt Penitentiary in Rennes, northwestern France. This wasn't just another prison. It was a supermax facility, designed to hold the most dangerous criminals in the country. Triple-layered security perimeters, anti-aircraft protocols, and a strict no-fly zone enforced by military radar. After Payet's second escape, the French government had taken extraordinary measures. Every prison housing high-risk inmates had been retrofitted with new defenses. Helicopter pads were surrounded by cable nets. Air defense systems were installed. Guards underwent specialized training for aerial threats. The message was clear: there would be no third escape. Pascal Payet had been placed in the most secure wing of Brécourt, in a cell monitored 24 hours a day by cameras with no blind spots. He was alone, isolated from other inmates, his communications restricted to brief, supervised phone calls with his lawyer. Every visitor was screened multiple times. Every letter was read and analyzed. The authorities had learned their lesson. They'd studied his methods, anticipated his moves, closed every loophole. Or so they thought. What they hadn't counted on was the sheer audacity of the man and the unwavering loyalty of those who owed him everything. At 5:30 in the morning, while most of France was still asleep, a helicopter lifted off from a private airfield near the town of Vitry, about 30 kilometers from the prison. The helicopter had been rented weeks earlier by a businessman claiming to need aerial photography for a real estate project. The paperwork was perfect, the identification flawless. But the businessman didn't exist. The pilot, a legitimate charter operator with decades of experience, believed he was flying a routine early morning job for a wealthy client. He was wrong. Minutes into the flight, 3 masked men who'd been silent in the passenger seats suddenly pulled weapons. A pistol pressed against the pilot's temple. A voice, cold and calm, gave him coordinates. The pilot's hands shook on the controls, but he complied. He had a wife, 2 children. He wanted to see them again. The helicopter banked hard, changing course toward Brécourt. As it approached the prison's airspace, alarms should have triggered immediately. Military protocols should have activated. But in a stunning failure that would spark a governmental investigation, the radar system was offline for routine maintenance. The anti-aircraft defenses were unmanned due to a shift change. And the cable nets over the exercise yard had been removed the previous week for repairs that hadn't yet been completed. It was a perfect storm of bureaucratic incompetence and terrible timing. Or perhaps it was something else. Investigators would later wonder if someone on the inside had been feeding information to Payet's crew, though nothing was ever proven. The helicopter descended rapidly, dropping into the prison yard with the same terrifying precision as before. But this time, the response was faster. Guards who'd been drilled for exactly this scenario opened fire immediately, their bullets sparking off the helicopter's frame. One of the masked men fired back with an assault rifle, forcing guards to take cover. Another used an angle grinder to cut through the bars on Payet's cell window, the screaming metal sending sparks flying into the pre-dawn darkness. Payet, already prepared, squeezed through the opening, his body lean from months of prison rations and calculated exercise. He grabbed the harness thrown to him and clipped in as bullets whined through the air around him. The helicopter began to rise, straining against the weight and the damage it had sustained. One of the rotor blades had been hit, and the aircraft shuddered violently, tilting at a dangerous angle. The pilot, despite his terror, fought to keep control, adjusting for the imbalance while men with guns shouted instructions at him. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the helicopter would crash, tumbling into the prison yard in a catastrophic fireball. But somehow, impossibly, it climbed. Payet dangled beneath it, swinging wildly as the aircraft gained altitude and speed. Guards below watched in disbelief and rage as Pascal Payet, the man who'd embarrassed their entire system, escaped for the 3rd time in 7 years. The helicopter limped across the countryside, smoke trailing from its damaged rotor. They landed in a field near the village of Briel-sur-Montfort, where 2 cars waited with engines running. The pilot was left unharmed but traumatized, still sitting in his seat when police found him 20 minutes later. Payet and his crew vanished into the French countryside, using back roads and safe houses they'd scouted months in advance. The manhunt that followed was the largest in modern French history. Every border was sealed. Every airport watched. Interpol issued a red notice. For 3 months, Payet remained free, moving through the shadows of criminal networks across Europe. But time was running out, and he knew it. His face was everywhere, his story international news. On September 21, 2008, Acting on intelligence from an informant, French special forces raided a small town in the mountains near the Spanish border. They found Payet in a modest apartment, alone, watching television coverage of his own manhunt. This time, he didn't smile. He didn't joke. He simply stood, placed his hands behind his head, and surrendered. The game was over. He was sentenced to an additional 15 years for his 3 escapes, to be served in complete isolation. He was transferred between prisons constantly, never staying in one place long enough to plan. His communications were severed. His visitors banned. The French prison system had finally learned how to contain Pascal Payet. But his legend lived on. In the criminal underworld, his name became synonymous with the impossible. 3 helicopter escapes, each more daring than the last. He'd exposed the vulnerabilities of an entire system, humiliated governments, and inspired a generation of criminals who believed that no cage could truly hold them. Yet in the end, the price was steep. Payet would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his freedom measured in memories of those brief, exhilarating moments when he soared above the law. As for the pilot forced to fly that final mission, he never flew again. He sold his helicopter, left the industry, and moved to a quiet town where the sky didn't remind him of the worst day of his life. And somewhere in a maximum security cell, Pascal Payet sits, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the small window near the ceiling, watching clouds drift across the sky, remembering the feeling of flight, knowing he'll never experience it again. The Sky Bandit had finally been grounded. But his story, told in hushed tones in prison yards across Europe, will never be forgotten.